Hello and welcome back to the Envisiontech podcast. I'm your host Paul Geoghegan, and this week I'm going to be talking about Braille and how Braille has transitioned into the 21st century. So Braille is one of those things that I feel like a lot of people are actually aware of, which is often not the case when it comes to assistive technologies or just people with disabilities. A lot of people aren't aware of the technologies that they use or how things may work for them. But Braille is really synonymous, and I'm not entirely sure why, but just in culture, even on TV shows, if there's a blind person, they're probably reading Braille. That, canes, which is usually the white stick that people have, or guide dogs are the three things that I feel like people kind of know about people who are blind. So Braille has been really important for people who are blind or visually impaired for quite a while now. And even for me, I think I learned Braille when I was 5 or 6, and I actually stopped using Braille for a while. But recently, I've kind of gotten back into a project where I've been involved in using Braille a bit more, and I wanted to kind of talk about how Braille has changed between when it was first invented and now, because it's actually really interesting how now we have smart devices that can actually output or take Braille as an input. So for those of you who don't know what Braille is, I'll tell you a little bit about that before I tell you about how it was invented. So Braille is essentially raised dots. And that might sound weird, and I guess it kind of is, when you think about it, but it's essentially little dots on a piece of paper, and it's what we call a Braille cell. So it's 2 by 3. So it's 2 wide by 3 high, if that makes sense. So you can have 6 possible dots, but different combinations of those dots make different letters. So for example, the letter A is dots 1. Well, just dot 1. And the dot numbers work. So the top left one is dot 1, the middle left is 2, the bottom left is 3, the top right is 4, the middle right is 5, and the bottom right is 6. So dot 1 is the top left dot, and that's A. Then B is dots 1 and 2, and you might think C is dots 1, 2, and 3, but no, it's actually dots 1 and dot 4. So that's how Braille kind of works. It's different combinations of dots to make different letters, and it gets a bit more complicated than that. Obviously it has punctuation, you can do math, and it has what we call contractions. So because Braille is written like that, some of the words can be a bit long, because they take up a bit more physical space than actual characters. So that's why we have contractions in Braille. So we have a contraction for the word the and you. There's loads of them. And some of them are for much longer words, and are formed with multiple characters as opposed to just one. The story of how Braille was actually invented is an interesting one. It was invented by a man called Louis Braille in 1824. He was actually born in 1809. So Braille is 200 years old this year, actually. And when he was quite young, he had an accident that meant that he got an eye infection in both of his eyes and he went blind. So from there, he did go to school when he was young, and he just learned by hearing, which, I can tell you that, listening to stuff is great, but obviously being able to actually read is a bit better. It's easier to remember, and obviously if you can take down notes, obviously back then you couldn't record anything, so you couldn't really listen to a book or anything like that. So he just had to essentially memorize everything, as far as I'm aware. But when he was, I think, around the age of 10, he actually got a scholarship to attend school in Paris, which was specifically meant for blind students. And that's actually where he came up with the idea for Braille, because he was visited by a French army officer who actually introduced them to a way that the military would communicate at nighttime. So obviously when it's nighttime you can't see, and obviously you don't want to be turning on lights or anything if you're in the military. That's not going to end well. So they had their own system for reading at night, and it was a 12 dot system. So unlike Louis, which would later be 6 dots, this was a 12 dot system, and that was actually his inspiration for Braille, was that initial system. So after he encountered that, he wanted to make it 6 dots that you could read it with just one finger. So you can read all 6 Braille dots with just one finger. A lot of the 12 dots would have been a lot harder to read. You would have had to use multiple fingers or move your finger around in order just to read one character or letter. So that's how Braille kind of came to be. It's been 200 years since Braille was invented, and it, had a not great reception when it was invented, as far as I'm aware. But nowadays, and even when I was growing up, it's been really widely adopted. And if you are blind, you probably have encountered Braille, or you probably know Braille. I know that I know Braille, and although I haven't used it properly in a couple of years now, I still know it like fluently. It's as if I'm speaking English, even though it's kind of its own little language. So over the years, there have been quite a few different what we call Braille codes, and Braille codes is essentially what each combination of the dots means. So in one Braille code, dot 1 might be A, but in another Braille code, dot 1 might be something else. And you might be thinking, oh yeah, that's obviously for different languages, so obviously, if you're doing Arabic Braille, it might be different from English Braille. Well, no, it was actually, even English Braille had different Braille codes. So if you learned Braille when I did, which is in the 2000s, well, you would have grown up learning British Braille if you lived here in Ireland. We use the same Braille code that they did in the UK. But if you grew up in the US, you used a different Braille code, which was specific to the US. And a lot of countries had their own Braille codes. Whether they spoke English or not, it didn't matter. There was this kind of divide between Braille codes. And that's really problematic, because Braille isn't as common as actual text. So if you bought a Braille book that was printed in the US or, wherever else in the world really, you might not be able to read it. And if you could read it, maybe you'd misunderstand some of the things, because maybe the contractions are different or some of the symbols are different, which is a really big deal. It's like you buy a book in English and it turns out it's actually in Spanish and you don't speak Spanish. So, what are you going to do? Well, now you can't read the book. So Braille codes were a big problem up until recently, where a system called UEB was invented. And now, I don't know the exact statistics on the adoption for this, and I wasn't part of creating the standard or anything like that, but it stands for Unified English Braille, I believe. And that, as the name says, attempts to kind of unify all these different English Braille codes. So instead of having one in the US and one here in Ireland and the UK, etc., you just have one. So that if you buy a book printed in the US, then you'll be able to read it if you can read Braille. And that solved a big problem with Braille, because, as I said, otherwise you would have all these different Braille codes that you would have to know. So, speaking of Braille books, I'll talk about one of the really big problems with Braille. So, as I mentioned, Braille isn't as common as regular text, right? And that means that you can't just go to a regular, bookstore or shop and buy a Braille book. So they were specifically printed by different companies or organizations. So if you needed a book, you might have to call them up and say, hey, do you have this book? Okay, no, well, could you print that book? And if so, how long would it take? So that was also a pretty big problem, because it could take quite a while to get a new Braille book, which was a big problem for me when I was in secondary school, or high school for those of you from America. And I was actually unable to access a lot of my books because they didn't have them and they had to make them. And they actually didn't even ever get me some of my books by the time that I had left secondary school. Another big problem with Braille books is how big they are. As I mentioned before, Braille characters actually take up more physical space than regular text characters. So sometimes I would be reading a book, even as a kid, and that book might be, obviously one actual book. But in Braille, you might have 20 what we would call volumes. So you would have each Braille book, which are pretty big themselves. They're probably about the size of an A3 sheet of paper, although it depends. They might be a bit smaller than that, but they're bigger than A4 paper as far as I remember. And you would have 20 of those for one book. So that was a problem because unless you carried around all 20 books, let's say for your math book or your biology book, you might be moving on to a section that you actually didn't have with you. Or even if you were reading a book for yourself, like at home, a book that you enjoyed reading, you would go to the library, you'd check out the first volume, you would finish that, then you'd go back and you'd get the second volume, and etc., etc. And I said sometimes there would be 20 or 30 volumes in some of these books. Some of them were huge, which, I mean, it's essentially like reading 30 regular books. Because I was pretty advanced in terms of reading Braille. I probably wasn't the best Braille reader in the world or anything like that, but I think I could read Braille pretty fast, but I definitely couldn't read as fast as somebody who was actually reading with their eyes. So Braille had a couple of drawbacks, especially because every time you had reached the end of a line in Braille, you would then have to go to the next line. So you would, you could do two things. You could move your hands down and then to the left, or you could move your hands to the left and then down to the next line. Which even that took a little bit of time to kind of get, in position to read the next line. So that was one of the reasons why it's a little bit slower. So a big solution to these problems, as has been, in a lot of cases recently, was modern technology. And when I say that, I mean that's because Braille kind of went digital in a sense. So instead of carrying around 20 Braille books, you would carry around a small Braille, what we would call a note taker or display. And how these devices worked is, well, it's kind of changed over the years. But at the start, they were kind of independent little computers. And you would turn it on and it would have a little row at the bottom. And some of them had more or less Braille cells, as what they were called. And each Braille cell was essentially a set of 8 dots, which I'll talk about now in a second, that would display your Braille. So when you turn it on, it would turn on and it would be on the home menu, and you would press the space bar, which I'll talk about how you typed in Braille now in a second. When you press the space bar, it would change whatever showed up on the little bottom line down the bottom. And how that worked is it would use little pistons, or some of them used kind of almost little spinnable kind of things where it would kind of rotate in different positions to represent different dots and dot combinations. As I mentioned, you could also type on these. And now you could write Braille before this with what we would call I don't know if this is a specific brand, but it's what we always called it, a Perkins Braille machine. So it was kind of like a typewriter, but instead of having all the keys for the whole alphabet, it had, I think, 9 keys. So on the very left, it had backspace, and then it had dot 3, 2, 1. Then in the middle, it had the space bar, and then it had dot 4, 5, and 6, and then it had enter on the other end. So that was essentially how you would type in Braille. So it was essentially 8 little, I almost want to call them levers, because you would kind of push them down with your fingers in order to type Braille. And Braille displays were very similar to that, and they had a very similar layout, so there would be 9 buttons going from left to right, and they'd be in the same order. So you would be able to turn on your Braille note taker or whatever your specific device was called. you'd be able to open up a document and you'd be able to type in there in Braille. And the reason why this Braille had 8 dots is because you would have to be able to tell where you were in the document. So it would have above each Braille cell, it had a little button that you could click to move your cursor. So just like you can in Microsoft Word, where you click on the screen, that was essentially how this worked. It was essentially like clicking on the screen, but there was a physical button that you could press in order to move your cursor to that position. And you could scroll. There were additional little buttons on the very bottom that would let you scroll line by line, so you could move through a document. And they were really, really cool. I remember getting mine. I was quite young at the time, but I believe I was one of the first people in Ireland to get one, and it made things so much better. Because even writing Braille, right, you would have a big folder and it would have all these sheets of Braille in it, and it was quite hard to keep it organized, and they were really bulky and thick. But all of a sudden, I could basically have a computer. So it's like if you went from a giant filing cabinet to having a laptop. You know, it's a huge difference. You can organize things way better. You can carry everything around with you. If you want to write something down, you don't need this big bulky machine that makes a lot of noise. You just have this little computer that you can type on. So it was a really, really huge advancement. And even then, it was quite basic. You could do things like send emails, and you could kind of browse the internet. You could do things like that, but really basic stuff. From there, they really started to evolve. So they went from Braille note takers essentially to actual computers. Some of them used Windows, some of them used Android, and some of them started to have touch screens. And that might sound a bit weird, but instead of having the physical keys that you would have had before where you would type your Braille, you would put your hands on this little sort of touch area. So there were no actual keys to type on. And that meant that they were essentially little tablets. And because they were little tablets, some of them even had screens. So if somebody wanted to, look at what you were doing, like if you were in school or, in work or whatever, and you wanted to show somebody a document, well, then you could, because they had a little screen. Previously, if you were writing in Braille, there's no real way to translate that unless somebody who is there with you can read Braille and write it down in actual text. So, yet again, another huge advancement right there. That kind of took Braille into the 21st century. It went from this 200-year-old idea that had a lot of problems and had a lot of different codes and issues into this unified Braille code that has now been digitalized and can now be used by anybody who has one of these devices. And they were very expensive when they first came out. I didn't actually buy mine. I was lucky enough that the school I went to was able to buy it for me, as far as I remember. And that was really lucky because they were super expensive. And they're still not really cheap. You can't go and buy one for 50 euros or anything like that. And if you can, it probably isn't very good, but I don't think that exists at all. But they are way cheaper. So even that has made things way easier for people. As opposed to, if you didn't go to a nicer school or they didn't have as much funding or you lived in like a more remote area, maybe, your school couldn't get you one or you couldn't afford one or whatever, but it makes a huge deal, and I sort of remember how much of a difference it made for me. Even just being able to print things out, because you could do that. I could take my little Braille note and I could go and I could take my document and I could put it on a USB, so I could actually show people what I had written. And when I was in primary school, or I think that's elementary school for Americans, my teacher could read Braille. So, I could hand her the Braille sheet and she could just read it with her eyes, which I think is very strange. Obviously, that's just because I read it with my hands, though. And that was great. But obviously, when I went into secondary school, well, not obviously, but none of my teachers could read Braille, or at least barely any of them if they could. So I could just print out my documents, which again is huge. You couldn't do that. If you were blind, what were you going to do? Like, you can't write out all that text, by hand. So even communicating with people, being able to send a letter, write an essay, go and get a job, these sort of new tools really opened up that whole world. So, up until recently, I was kind of the opinion that Braille was going away, that Braille was obsolete. But as I said, I've actually started working with it a bit more recently. And that wasn't my exact opinion, it was a bit more complicated than that. But, I hadn't used it in quite a while, and I use a screen reader. But I've been working with it a bit more, and honestly, it reminded me of how much I liked Braille and how nice it is to be able to read something, by yourself. Screen readers are fantastic, and I love them, and I'm still going to use them. That's what I'm used to now at this point. And I think especially as a developer, it makes it a bit easier. I've never tried to use a Braille display for developing, but I've been using a screen reader now for years, so I'm probably going to stick with that. But honestly, it is nice to be able to pick up a box with some kind of medicine in it and just read what's in it, because there's Braille on there. I don't have to take out my phone, try and point it at the box, hope that it picks up the text and maybe reads it out correctly if I'm even looking at the right side of the box, which I always seem to find the opposite side of the box. It's really nice just to be able to do that. Or even if you're in like a lift, some lifts have Braille to tell you what button is for which floor. So you don't have to say, okay, well, this is the bottom button, so this might be the ground floor. But you might be wrong. It might be the basement, so then you end up, pressing the wrong button or anything like that. Braille is great just because of how easy it is to use. And I feel like it is quite universal. So I think Braille has been modernized in a great way. It's really been brought into the 21st century. And if you're interested, I definitely encourage you to learn more. And I'm going to try and include some Braille characters in the description because you can do that now. Just so that you can take a look at it for yourself. So that's going to be it for this week's episode. And if you want to learn more about Braille, I'm not even going to try and recommend you a place because there are so many. There's the American Foundation for the Blind. There's, I don't even know how many. Every country seems to have its own organization, and even then there's extra ones, and there's other websites set up by actual blind people, etc., etc., etc. So if you're interested in Braille, look it up. Read the Wikipedia page. I don't know, just look up Braille if you're interested, because there's so many resources out there that it's a bit hard for me to recommend you one, because honestly, a lot of them are really good. And I said if you're interested in seeing some Braille, I'll include some in the description of this episode, just so you can kind of take a look at what it says. And I'll include what it actually means as well below it, so don't worry if you don't understand Braille. But yeah, so that's it for this week's episode. I really do hope that you enjoyed. I've been your host, Paul Geoghegan. This has been the Envisiontech podcast, and I will talk to you all next week.